Welcome to Voices with Vervaeke. So I have a very special guest today. So my guest is Juensung Kim. Let me tell you a little bit about Juensung. I first met him teaching him a high school class on classical civilization a long time ago. And then he came to U of T and did cognitive science with me. And now he is a TA in, I think, at least two of my courses right now. On RA. He's also a collaborator where we write papers together, we make craft presentations together. He's also my lab manager for the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab. Juensung is currently a graduate student working with Michelle Ferrari as his official supervisor, and with me as sort of an unofficial supervisor. He refers to Michelle and me as his mom and dad. I think I'm the mom. I'm not quite happy about that, but nevertheless, it's great to have him here. And Juensung's career is just taking off right now. He recently got a major publication in a premier journal. I'll let him talk about that in a sec. But he has taken up the torch, if that isn't condescending to him. I mean it as a compliment, of doing the cognitive science of religion and spirituality. And his own research is just taking off. And so I'm just really excited to have him here. So welcome, Juensung.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm Juensung. I have worked under, for, and with John for nearly a decade now. Jeez, let's not think about that too hard.
Yeah.
And as mentioned, my particular areas of specialty are the cognitive science of spirituality, of religion, of lifespan development. By and large, my own area of research can be summarized as the study of intentional growth. So my focus is on ways in which people can change and develop on purpose. As opposed to, psychological growth being something that just happens to you as a result of fate or circumstance or accident. My interest is in the ways that people can take charge of their own development. So this has, of course, led me through research in mindfulness, research in spiritual practices, research in magic and mysticism, a little bit of research in the martial arts. We do need to finish that paper.
Yes.
And so that's where I'm coming from all of this. I think my thinking is, I'd say 50% John's fault and 50% the fault of myriad other influences who I've had the good fortune of being able to study with over the last 10 years.
Like I said, I think of Juensung more as family. So what I want to talk about, which is in the purview of Voices with Vervaeke, is the work. So you mentioned a paper you and I are working on which we need to finish, a naturalistic account of the key phenomena or the chi phenomena within the internal martial arts and related healing modalities. You've done some work with Michelle, I know, on people's use of the I Ching. You've been recently doing quite a bit of work on what you call the cognitive science of magic. Now, you don't mean by magic anything involving supernatural forces. I know you have a paper that's under review right now. I forget which psych journal it is.
So that one's the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, actually. Right, yeah. But I think the seeds of that line of thinking. So sure, let's jump right into it. What do we mean by magic here? The seeds of that line of thinking can actually be found in another publication that Michelle and I just got accepted in the Humanistic Psychologist, right, which is on the history of the psychology of religious experiences. So what we do in that paper is we track the phenomenological study of religion as compared to the sociological study of religion, which is a little bit more constant through history, to, shall we say, three separate waves. You have the original wave at the kind of end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century with William James, Edwin Starbuck, and some of the actual great original luminaries in the history of psychology. Then it fades away a little bit as experimental behaviorism becomes a dominant paradigm. because, you know, as we reason, it is very difficult to induce a religious experience in the laboratory.
Right.
You know, we've had some success recently with psychedelics inducing mystical experiences, but as we get into in the paper, the extent to which those are religious experiences under a strict definition is not clear.
Right.
And then there's also the, ironically, increasing development of psychology as a science, leading to a lack of careful familiarity with philosophical tools, religious and spiritual literature, and the just general toolbox you would need to actually study a religious experience properly.
Right.
So ironically, as a Watsonian vision of psychological science becomes dominant, your toolbox to study certain phenomena degrades rapidly. We then find that this comes back in the post-war era with the work of Jung and Maslow and the kind of great humanistic existential psychologists who start to become a little bit more interested in individual experience. Actually, there's somebody points out in one of their books, I can't remember who it is off the top of my head, unfortunately, that the psychology of religion and the psychology of sexuality almost switch places over that 30-year span.
Oh, interesting.
Where, you know, William James writes an entire classic on the psychology of religion and 2 pages on human sexuality at the dawn of the 20th century. But then Kinsey, who's writing in this kind of 40s, 50s, and 60s period, writes, you know, text after text after paper about human sexuality, and nobody's talking about religion.
Yeah.
So, you know, that is yet another boom of the psychology of religious experience. And here you start to see the beginnings of what I think is important to understand in any sort of cognitive science of magic or spirituality, which is a decoupling of the theoretical from the practical. I'm especially using those terms to hearken back to James Fraser's distinction between theoretical magic and practical magic.
Right.
Where you have your underlying metaphysics and ontology of the entities at play, your explanations of how things work, you know, what you would call the language of training versus the language of explanation.
Right.
So, and you see this earlier in John Dewey's work. He starts to mention this, but it really starts to get taken up by especially Maslow. This idea that religion and spirituality as practices do not require the supernatural as a theory to function.
Right. Yes.
So that's where you start to see these things kind of peel apart. And then we kind of characterize the current era of research on mystical experiences and religious experiences as really being defined by that final cleaving between the experience and the interpretation.
Right.
You know, we do get into, well, is this really the right idea? Can we actually distinguish experience from interpretation? You know, I think one of our recent experiments demonstrates pretty handily that that's a really tough nut to sell.
Yeah, that's right.
But, you know, this is kind of where the field is going. So when I'm talking about the cognitive science of magic, what I'm interested in is essentially looking at how much of the practical side of spirituality, of religion, of magic, of mysticism, of all of these practices that have traditionally relied on the supernatural, can we replace their theoretical side with good cognitive science?
Right.
With, you know, this approach almost gives us a sort of a Turing test, right? Where if the idea of a Turing test is a sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence, if a sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence should be able to perfectly mimic human interaction, then practices derived from a cognitive scientific interpretation of magic should be able to replicate the practices of a traditionally trained magician.
Right.
From what I've seen, that might be a tall order, and we might be 40 or 50 years out, but I think it's manageable at some point.
So I like this move you're making, because it's obviously right, about deeply trying to bridge between cognitive science and the part of that family, mysticism, magic, religion, and spirituality, that is often the one that is held up as the exemplar of irrational behavior, kookiness, superstitious, supernatural metaphysics, etc. And so if I understand you correctly, and I read some of your work and participate in it with you, so I hope I do.
You've marked some of it.
Yeah, yes. And you're doing something analogous to what I tried to do, and it's in the Awakening for the Meaning Crisis, around shamanism, and try and say, without adopting the shaman's metaphysical view, can we understand both the phenomenology and the functionality of shamanism? What's happening in the altered states of consciousness, why that might facilitate healing, why it might improve hunting. So I take it that you're doing something analogous and like that, and extended from that. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes, I'd say that's a pretty accurate interpretation, especially because I think the work on shamanism was kind of the seed idea for this.
Right.
Where, if you look at the history of human spirituality, shamanism is kind of the art, the proto art.
Right.
It is magic, it is spirituality, it is mysticism, it is religion, it is science, it is mindfulness, all wrapped into this singular bundle of kind of original human psychological technologies.
Yeah. And as you know, I agree with Matt Rosano and Michael Winkelman and David Lewis Williams that, shamanism is probably the psychotech, the ecology of practices that really drove the huge cognitive leap happening in the Upper Paleolithic transition. So even though that does not in any way give scientific evidence for the truth of shamanistic metaphysics, it does say that the phenomenology and the language of training within shamanism is doing very, very powerful things. So can you give me an example, well, several examples? Let's just go crazy, Juensung, of how you're bringing this work to various practices that have been called magical, and some of the cog sci around that.
Sure. So, oh boy, where do we want to start here? I think it might be good to start historically, actually.
Sure.
To kind of give people a bridge from shamanism into magic and mysticism proper, and then go from there.
Sure, please.
So, something that I'll occasionally say to people when they ask me why I'm studying magic is, my argument is that magic is a human birthright. It is, I would say, the oldest faculty we have that really distinguishes us from other very complex troping animals.
Right.
If it is true that shamanism was the driving factor in the Upper Paleolithic revolution, then magic is why humans are the dominant species on Earth. Which is going to be a very strange sentence for a lot of people listening to this.
Yeah, yes.
But hear me out. So there are direct lines to shamanism that you can find throughout history that evolve in one way or another. And actually, I would say you can characterize the axial revolution as essentially the filtering and formalizing of certain aspects of shamanic psychotechnology relative to the culture that the revolution is occurring in.
Ah, well said.
So in ancient Greece, for example, the sociological pressures, I think, are very well laid out in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So I won't go over them here.
Sure.
But you get the powers of watching the natural world, of looking for fixed points, of abstract reasoning and symbolism, just condensed through Pythagoras, through Socrates, from the Thracian shamanic tradition.
Yeah, very
just
much.
Kind of almost as a series of lenses focusing sunlight into something more concentrated and powerful.
Right.
Not quite as broadly applicable, but you do get this very, very powerful psychotechnology that is excellent at picking out the constants in the natural world.
Right.
Now, if you go to India, what I think the Vedas represent is another concentration of shamanic practices, but these are the shamanic practices for, shall we say, internal phenomenological manipulation.
Right, right.
You know,
Altered states of consciousness.
yes, basically the manipulation of one's own consciousness is kind of the filtered ability. And you could even argue that what you get in the Abrahamic tradition is kind of the concentration of the power of narrative from the shamanic tradition.
Yeah, right, right.
And China, I would say, is, you know, they're a little bit more manifold, I think. But the psychotechnology that I would say is par excellence in China is the capacity for tracking change.
Right, right.
You know, you get this through the classic of changes. You get this in a very biodynamic approach to medicine. You get this in, it's very interesting to track the evolution of Chinese science versus Greek science, because Greek science is very focused on constants in the natural world, whereas Chinese science is very focused on dynamics.
Oh, right. So you see that even in like the sort of the flow within Tai Chi Chuan and things like that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so I would say, you know, the ability to track and affect change is what really goes on in the Chinese the axial revolution in China.
Right.
So, you know, the reason why I'm going through all of this is because you do kind of see this splitting of the original shamanic psychotechnology,
right,
into forms of psychotechnology that become, shall we say, mainstream.
Right, 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 right.
Now, this especially becomes clear in ancient Greece and Rome and Europe. But we get the word magic from the Greek word for Persian, especially Zoroastrian priests.
Right, right.
Mags. So the term magic has its origins in a word meaning the psychotechnologies of the other.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The significant other for Greek culture too. The Persian.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know, the in Chinese, for example, the word for magic and the word for shaman are pretty much the same thing. You know, it depends on who you talk to. There is this word for magic that largely means otherworldly. There's also a word for magic that means shamanic. But you know, basically the shaman's toolkit fractures depending on where you go in the world.
Right.
And especially in, you know, Greece and Greek intellectual descendants, the non-kosher parts of it, shall we say, right, become magic, but they're still part of this same toolkit.
Right. Okay. That's well argued.
So when I am referring to magic, I am essentially referring to the entire toolkit. I don't use the word shamanism because I would reserve the term shamanism to refer to a very raw form of this toolkit in its original integrated context.
Right, right.
Because in the thousands of years between shamanism and magic, magic gets complicated.
Right, 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 right.
The symbolism becomes incredibly diverse, incredibly rich, incredibly complex. The rituals diversify and specify. You know, if you look at medieval grimoires, for example, they are complex instruments.
Right, right, right.
And, you know, the classic grimoire, and this is the case no matter where you go in the world. There are Chinese grimoires, there are Indian grimoires. Currently taking a look at a Hebrew grimoire, which is an interesting lark. Right. And, you know, this is kind of why I want to say, like, magic is everywhere. Right. Magic is just the complexified historical descendants of ancient shamanic psychotechnologies.
So is it fair to say then that there are still sort of broadly, given the way you've described the origin, sort of three domains in which we could see sort of psychotech for altering states of consciousness kind of coming, you know, And in that sense, technically, mindfulness practice would be a kind of magical practice, right? Because
Yes.
in fact, I think McClellan in his book, The Wisdom of Hypatia, says that magic is the art of being able to change consciousness at will.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's not wrong. Actually, if you'll allow me this comparison,
Yeah.
the core disciplines of Stoicism, of logic, ethics, and physics,
Right.
actually, I think make an excellent framework to split magic.
Right. What people have to understand that logic for the Stoics means much more, not just what is now logic today. It means much more like psychology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just basic reasoning skills. Like, if you twisted my arm a little bit, I would say that from original shamanic magic, the Greco-Roman tradition inherited logic, the Vedic tradition inherited ethics, and the Chinese tradition inherited physics.
Right. But what I was going to do, that's great. But I was going to say, there's your sort of domains where you're transforming consciousness,
Yes.
and domains where you're trying to pick up on what is most constant. Unless people think that's only a scientific practice, one way of understanding mysticism is to try and get at, the ground of being, the ultimate reality, which is the most constant. And then you also have the ability to try and track changes. And, this has been picked up more recently, in 4E cognitive science, where, Alicia Araro talks about the use of narrative, right, in order to turn your cognition into something like a dynamical system, so you can better track the dynamical systems of the environment, the ecology. And so is that a fair way of parsing it? So that you could look at sort of psychotech for sort of tracking dynamical systems, psychotech for transforming consciousness, and then psychotech for trying to get at sort of what is most constant in reality. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. And, you find forms of magic that work for all of them. Like, every magical tradition contains a meditative tradition.
Yeah.
In terms of just trying to kind of ground out your own issues. Right. But then, you get divination for tracking patterns. There's this fantastic project going on at Harvard that they call Predictionx, which is an attempt to collate and systematize every way that humans have ever tried to predict the future. And it goes all the way from Babylonian haruspicky all the way to modern stats.
Right.
And I just love seeing the things just put on the same graph, because they're completely right. That's all we're doing.
So this picks up on sort of the predictive processing model.
Yes.
And I know that you and Daniel Gregg have been talking about that. In the work you're doing.
Yeah.
So
the way that I would kind of build on that other definition of magic as the ability to kind of change consciousness at will is magic, by and large, is using techniques of imagination to bootstrap powers of cognition.
Yeah, I think that is very well said. And that goes well with the predictive processing model, because it sees imagination basically as the top-down predictive aspect, and sensation of perception is sort of the bottom-up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and and this is why I think we've had this conversation. I think we need to go back to a more Aristotelian way of looking at the imagination.
Yeah.
Where, the senses do not integrate in and of themselves. You have this, what they refer to as the common sense, that sticks them all together. But you have control over that common sense. So you can stick senses together in all sorts of ways.
So that getting disciplined practices that you could train to be able to transform that common sense would then impact on the kinds of patterns you were able to pick up on within yourself, within others, and within the world, and sort of couple to the world in more powerful ways. Is that also a way of understanding what we're talking about here?
Yes, absolutely. And you've heard me talk about this before. You can only process things you can imagine.
Right, yeah.
So the more limited you are in scope of your imagination, ultimately, the less rational you are.
Yes, I agree with that.
And, people like to rag on practices of imagination as being irrational and fancy and things like that. It's a little bit like saying going to the gym is an artificial recreation of tasks you will actually have to perform in the world.
Yeah.
That's true. You still go to the gym because it expands your base capacity to do things in the world.
Right, right. So that's a very yeah. I like the gym or the dojo analogy. Uh, uh, so well, that sort of segues into what I wanted to ask you, which is, there's a lot of people who are probably watching this and they have knives out, and they're looking for any way. I mean, there's two groups. There's the people who are sort of are self-designated as being rational, and then you said there's an important relationship between imagination and rationality. And like I've said before, I think both the Calvinist and the Romantic understanding of imagination are sort of are defective by being different kinds of extremes. So I can see, right, that the rationalist coming in and saying that this is all just superstitious crap, and then I can hear religious people coming in and saying this is all just heresy, etc., etc. So let's do the first group first, because I think that's where like a lot. I mean that. I know you're respectful of religious traditions, but I can tell in a lot of the work you're really wrestling with those who come in, like I said, self-designated as the defenders of rationality, and say, why are you doing this? This is all just, there's a simple explanation for all of this, which is people are just superstitious and irrational, and that if they were just rational, and usually the implicit thing is rational like me, then we wouldn't need to do any of this. But you've been trying to show, first of all, how pervasive it is and how functional it is, and that, like you said, it's possible to understand the functionality without committing to the metaphysics. So, like I said, can you give us some of those arguments?
Sure. So I think my first argument to the skeptic as far as rationality goes is it's not going away.
Yeah.
This is, if you read the works of Rossano, of Winckelmann, of Tanya Luhrmann,
yeah.
Actually most of whom I've met and are all fantastic people.
Yes.
Sorry, just at a weird point in my life. This is just part of human makeup. And if you read, Jason Josephson Storm has a fantastic book called The Myth of Disenchantment.
Right.
And I will yet again say Jason Josephson Storm has one of the best names I've ever heard.
Yes.
It's a fantastic name for a guy who studies magic. Anyway, his point is that, we like to pretend we are living in this world of disenchantment, post Weber's whole point about the great disenchantment and things like that, which I would argue you refer to as the disembedding, because they're functionally the same thing.
Right, yes.
And Josephson Storm's point is, no, we're not. If you look at the statistics of who believes in the supernatural, who believes in ESP, who believes in aliens and things like that, proportions have not changed in over 100 years.
Right.
Science is great, but, magic has always existed in the cracks. Actually, I think my favorite finding of his is that who believes, like, the proportion of the population that believes in one thing versus another thing has not changed in the last couple of 100 years. But what's funny to him is that the belief systems are mutually exclusive. For example, people who believe in psychics do not believe in witches.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Well, because basically the argument is that, like, these people have constructed a coherent system to explain how these things work. And, like, I've looked at the ESP kind of framework. I prefer the magic framework because it's older and has a little bit more generalizability. But yeah, if you believe in people who are psychokinetic, you don't need magic. It's all psychokinesis.
Right.
Meanwhile, if you believe in magic, you don't need psychokinesis. It's all magic. So the reason why I start there is because, let's be honest. Humans are not born inherently rational. At least not the way that people tend to use that word. What people are born with is a capacity for utilitarian pattern finding.
Right.
So, basically what all of these people who believe in some supernatural thing or another are doing is they are having experiences that science does not do a very good job of explaining or addressing, and they are attempting to patch them into a worldview.
Right.
Now, like, because I've even encountered scientists who are like, I don't know, man, I found this thing and it's weird.
Yeah.
You know, part of scientific training is the ability to sit with doubt and mystery. I'm not knocking that. I'm not knocking scientific training. I think it's important. I've got 10 years of it.
Yeah.
You know, 10 years of it under a very good teacher. But this isn't me saying that superstition or the supernatural is necessary. It's me saying that it's an understandable part of people trying to figure out a way to actually live and work and act in the world. Because one of the things, you know, you can't just have pure language of training, right?
Right.
You have to have some sort of a language of explanation.
Right.
And
go ahead.
yeah, I'd say the biggest issue is you know, Michelle, my, you know, supervisor on paper, he's a big believer in what William James referred to as radical empiricism.
Yeah.
If a human can experience it, you must be able to study it.
Right.
No, there has to be some sort of underlying systematicity to human experience, even if the way that a human experienced something is completely non-replicable.
Right.
Right. Like, you know, the uniqueness of identity being a thing, it could be that there is no plausible way that anybody else will ever have this, like, one experience. It's a little bit like, my dad was telling me a story because he's a big baseball fan of this guy who he hit the ball and it lined up just perfectly so that a bird flew in front of the ball right as it was going down the pitch, and you just see this explosion of feathers as the universe lines up just right for this ball to hit the bird. That's never going to happen again.
Right.
But under the laws of physics, it can happen. So James's argument is that even if it's never going to happen again, under the laws governing human experience, it is clearly possible for it to happen. So therefore, we must be able to understand it somehow,
Right.
if we want to assume there's some sort of systematicity. And I do have to say, mainstream science does a terrible job at cleaving to that kind of a thing.
Right.
A lot of academics, a lot of people who claim to be rational, and I will say claim to be because, you know, I do believe that you need to have a sufficiently powerful imagination in order to be properly rational, because otherwise you're looking at the world with one eye shut.
Yeah.
So, you know, and, you know, we know this. People are not good judges of their own rationality.
Yes.
So, you know, I guess my rebuttal to the pseudo-rationalists is twofold. One is the practical consideration of people are having experiences that systematically track something, you know, like all the Wiccans that I've talked to, like, you know, they do the rituals and something happens, right? And, you know, I've been hanging out with a Sufi group for part of the last year, and that's a very powerful experience. And yes, you do experience something.
Yes.
And, you know, they need to have some sort of system to put it all in, because otherwise, how do you share it? And the second part of my rebuttal is, if your argument that something is not rational is that you have not personally experienced it, nor can you conceive of it happening, that is a poor argument.
Yes.
The world is huge. People are diverse. People are capable of having all sorts of experiences that you will never have.
So that's good. So a third argument I'll want you to apply to is, yeah, but the only reason this persists is just because people are persistently stupid and irrational. And I get it. That's still question begging because of your previous two arguments. But I think you also have an independent response to that. You want to say, well, there's another explanation for the persistence. I don't think you deny that there's some self-deception going on in these things, and people are playing power politics and doing all kinds of stuff with.
Oh, absolutely. And
Yeah.
people do that in science,
People
right?
do that in science. People do that in art. People do that in politics. So let's just acknowledge that self-deception is rampant. Okay, putting that aside, you say, yeah, independent of that, I think you say there's another important reason for the persistence of what you're calling magic, namely is it has important functionality. It
Yes.
transforms people. It enables them to learn. It enables them to aspire. It enables them to access aspects of the psyche or their own body or psychosomatic interaction that they can't.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I apologize. I might have left that implicit in my previous answers, but the bottom line is this stuff works.
Yeah.
It may not work in the exact way that the metaphysics that they're holding up says, because, we've known since the 1950s from Arthur Reber's work that people cannot explain their own pattern finding.
Yeah. Yeah.
They cannot. It does not matter how rational you are. You cannot explain your own pattern finding. I am sure with a sufficient amount of time and training, you might be able to do it, but people are just bad at it. So let's forgive that as just part of human psychology. That's unfortunately slightly unavoidable. And let's be a little charitable and point out people do not keep things that do not work.
Right.
Or at least, let me rephrase that. People do not keep things that do not perform some sort of a function, right? Even if that function is just nostalgia. And we're finding increasingly, like, we're cleaving off pieces of shamanism and magic and turning them into clinical psychology over and over and over again. We're taking psychedelics, we're taking ritual, we're taking, mindfulness practices and things like that.
Right.
Every time we have taken something from magic and changed its metaphysics into science, suddenly it works.
Yes.
Hear me out. It's not the change in metaphysics that's making it work.
Yes. Very well said. Although perhaps the change in metaphysics, and this is going to be a segue to my next question, allows you to bring science to bear and perhaps reverse engineer or improve it to some degree.
Yes.
And so,
I've joked about this for years, where my entire tagline is sufficiently analyzed magic.
yeah. So this brings me to the question, which is, I know this from your work, but just to give you an opening here, so cognitive science, especially 4E cognitive science, plays a special role in doing that, in resituating these practices and explaining their functionality, and perhaps enhancing their functionality. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
So this will actually require me to backtrack a little bit, because sometimes it is the change in metaphysics that allows it to work. Actually, the first publication that I was ever on was on the influences of the prosperity gospel on risk-taking behavior.
Right.
And one of the findings particularly sticks out to me. I thought this was clever on behalf of the first author, Nick Hobson, who he studies ritual. He's a good guy. Anyway, the finding was, I helped mostly with the theory bit. So during data collection, participants were exposed to a clip of Joel Osteen preaching the prosperity gospel.
Right.
And, lo and behold, they found that, exposure to hearing the prosperity gospel makes people indulge in risk-taking behaviors as, tested through a gambling task afterwards.
Now, does that mean that they have to explicitly believe in the sort of...
So here's the thing, right? Is they did this in a follow-up study where they split it into atheists and theists.
Right.
And then made two versions of the recording. One of them was the original recording, and the other was the recording scrubbed of any mentions of God or the Bible or what have you.
Right.
Original recording was, preacher giving a sermon, and the scrubbed recording was designated as motivational speaker giving a talk.
Right.
Here's the kicker. If you scrub everything out of the, if you scrub God and the Bible out of the recording, it works on atheists. There was an amplified effect for the prosperity gospel and theists, suggesting that there is more of a buy-in effect the more you buy into it.
Right, right.
But, this is where I do kind of have to backtrack on my own. It's not the change in metaphysics that makes the thing work, but it is the change in metaphysics that makes the thing accessible, which is what allows it to work.
Ah, that's better. That's much more precise and helpful. Thank you. So the metaphysics, we might even think, this is just occurring to me now, the metaphysics has sort of an explaining function, but it also has this new function you mentioned. It gives you an accessibility function. It allows you to access the practice from your particular worldview. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So there might be three languages. There might be a language of training. There might be a language of explaining, and then there might be a language of accessing or making it accessible. That's interesting.
Well, there's perspectival language, right?
Right. Yeah.
Participatory perspectival language.
Yeah, right.
Because underneath all of this, you have to have the basic way in which you're looking at the world that allows certain things to be possible versus impossible. Right? Just the basic filter of relevance realization needs to be set up in a particular way.
Right.
Now, granted, it's one of those things where I know Anderson does this a lot and I've gotten into it. You need to learn to play with your own metaphysics of what's possible versus impossible.
Right.
If you don't have certain grounding practices, and, unfortunately, not to get political or anything, but not interrogating your own worldview is what allows people to be manipulated. Especially through conspiracy theories and things like that.
Right.
Because if you look historically, part of the proper education of a shaman or a magician or a spiritualist or anything is learning to warp your own field of possibility and find your way back.
Right.
It's especially the find your way back bit that's important. And, this is why you find a meditative tradition in every single magical tradition, because you need a grounding practice to be able to find your way back to reality, or at least whatever reality you're working with.
So that's good. Could you give another example, perhaps the work you did with Michelle, like on the I Ching, or the work you're doing with me on Qi, about how cognitive science can explain these phenomena, it can explain both the phenomenology and the functionality in an integrated fashion?
Sure. So actually, let's do the I Ching one, just because that's top of mind, and because it's a classic example of magic that everybody wants to dismiss out of hand, that they can't dismiss out of hand for two reasons. One, they don't know what it is, and two, they don't know how it works.
Right.
So the I Ching is probably going to be, or properly the I Ching is going to be familiar to most people as a manual of Chinese fortune telling. Very famously translated by Wilhelm and Baines and commented on by Jung. The Jungian commentary is terrible. I say this with all due respect. He was a psychologist bound to a certain place and time, did not have certain resources available to him. But, I speak like kindergarten, first grade level Mandarin and read classical Chinese decently due to having an education in Chinese philosophy. One of our co-authors, my lab mate, Anne, is fluent. So we were able to actually access the classical Chinese sources, and Jung's commentary does not hold up if you look at the classical literature.
Right.
Anyway, but the operative, we kind of use the I Ching as a lens because it was convenient and interesting, and it's what we had access to. But the argument works for all forms of divination. So first things first, fortune telling does not do what you think it does. And this is, I've studied with the Wiccan Church of Canada for the last year as well to kind of get the emic understanding on magic as well.
Yeah, right.
And they are also very clear on this. Divination does not tell you the check is going to be in the mail next Tuesday.
Right.
What divination does, and this is a difficult thing to explain outside of either Chinese or Neoplatonic metaphysics, but most magical systems look at the natural order of life, fate, the universe, the planet, and things like this as kind of an ongoing river.
Right.
Individual human choices can vaguely shape the flow of the river, but ultimately a river flows one way.
Right.
What divination practices allow you to do is gauge what's happening downstream. Especially practices like tarot card reading or I Ching divination are essentially acts of, I find myself at a crossroads. I could act this way or I could act this way. Assuming I act in one particular way, what kind of consequences am I looking at downstream?
Right.
What do I need to avoid? What could possibly come up? Things like this. Like the I Ching is especially full of this because a lot of its readings are things like, you know, well, a superior person would do this. A foolish person is going to have this happen to them. Don't do this.
Right. Right.
So, and the Wiccans especially are very clear on never ask divination for specifics, never go fishing in a divinatory system. It doesn't work that way. So, you know, that's...
So how does it work then? Like, I mean, in cognitive scientific terms, because that's what we're trying to do here.
So let's go back to that Reber stuff that we were talking about before. Right? So we know that people are terrible at, you know, gauging their own pattern recognition.
Right.
You know what people are not terrible at? Pattern recognition itself.
Right.
People are fantastic at finding hidden patterns.
Yes.
And, you know, unfortunately, this has ruined a lot of research in the past, right? Like, if there's any sort of pattern in your randomized scheme, people will find it. We found this with the blind sight research, you know, all sorts of things. Humans are fantastic at implicit pattern recognition. I doubt there is anything on the planet that is better than we are.
Right. Implicit meaning that they can detect, and this is what Reber showed, they can pick up very complex patterns without being aware that they're doing so or knowing how they do so, even if they become aware that they're doing so.
Right. You know, this is just a thing we do as humans.
Right.
Now, let's say we're back in the day and you don't have modern statistical software or things like that to do your prediction, right? The human faculty for implicit pattern recognition is your best tool for predicting the future. In fact, arguably, that's what it's for. You know, the two hunting strategies that humans developed both necessitate the capacity to predict the future.
Right.
Because our hunting strategies are chase something until it dies of exhaustion.
Right.
So we need to predict where the thing is going, or throw rock at moving target, which also requires our ability to predict where the thing is going. So basically, this thing is very, very well developed for predicting future events.
Right.
You know, this is hypotheses. This is telling. This is, you know, predicting the weather. This is basic if this then that. Right. And what Reber showed is that we do this on a level so implicitly that we can't actually figure out what the heck we're doing. Now, skip to the work of Keith Oatley, which is, he looks at narrative as a sort of modeling software.
Right.
So, you know, you read fiction and it allows you to, you know, practice that kind of predictive ability.
Right. So fiction, I mean, in that sense, is part of what you're talking about, this training of the imaginative faculty. I mean, one of the reasons why we read great literature is it trains our imagination, so we're much better at understanding other people, picking up on patterns intuitively about how they're moving around in the world, what they're thinking, what they're seeing, what they're believing. But they just don't label that as magic.
No, they don't. They should, but they don't.
Right.
You know, especially because and here's where we'll get into things. The purpose of a divination system is to create an artificial grammar.
Right.
You know, and this is one of the reasons why I rag on astrology a little bit, because it requires a reach to construct an artificial grammar, because part of the point is that it needs to be randomized, and astrology is a closed system. Right. I don't know. I kind of treat astrology as the magical equivalent of genetics. Anyway, so what you're doing when you're casting lots or drawing cards or things like that is you are creating an artificial randomized symbolic grammar.
Right.
Which allows you to, you know, when I'm describing this in layperson's terms, I describe it as fly paper for thoughts.
Right.
You know, this is a fantastic instrument. Unfortunately, it is notoriously fickle. It is, you know, this is why people meditate, right? Like, think about pink elephants and think about nothing but pink elephants for the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's not possible.
Yeah. Right.
Not without massive powers of concentration that take decades to train. So what you're doing with a divination tool is you are creating a structure out there in the world to project your imagination onto, so that you can bootstrap the association game that your brain plays with everything to project narrative order onto your implicit pattern recognition.
Right, and this, well, and then Aliso Uraro also talks about how narrative gets our mind working in a way that's very good at picking up on complex dynamical systems because of the way narrative, layers things and has them, feedback and small differences and context sensitivity and blah, 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 blah.
Yes, so you get to use, basically what you're doing is you're bootstrapping a few different things here. You're bootstrapping basic complex pattern recognition.
Right.
Narrative processing, which allows you to massively accelerate the complexity of the information that you're dealing with.
Right.
And symbolism.
Right.
And I think, as you've discussed in other videos, symbols are very powerful because they allow you a very complex, multi-apt thing to stick pieces of cognition to, so that you don't have to carry them around in your head.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
So, and there's a ritual element to divination as well, right? And this is where traditional Wiccan literature and Nick Hobson's work overlap. Is the thing that ritual is fantastic for is regulating emotion and shaping intent. Right,
which also then impacts on the bioenergetic aspects of cognition and consciousness. I wanted to ask you about the randomness because, I mean, you and I have done related work on this too. I mean, this reminds me of, and Daniel talks about this too, and I talk about it too, the disruptive strategies for inducing insight, or in neural networks, how you throw noise into the system, so you prevent it from overfitting. So to use your kind of language, you open up the space of patterns that you can.
Yes. Yeah, it's, there's both a selective constraint and an enabling constraint going on in the process of divination. There is an enabling constraint that massively expands the number of patterns that you can possibly be processing at once.
Right.
And there's certain forms of meditation, they teach you to kind of let go of the grip that you've got on your reasoning. So active imagination essentially gets massively accelerated. The symbols having qualitative, fluid meanings rather than strictly defined fixed meanings also has an impact on this.
Semiotic drift.
Yeah. But the randomized element and the ritual setting creates a selective constraint on the divination process. So it's basically kind of one of those, let's say that you could normally come up with 3 patterns, select one, right? What divination allows you to do is, instead of going, draw 3, pick 1, it's draw 10, pick 4. Right. So it's, a basic strategy for massively expanding the number of patterns that you can hold at once and artificially constraining the selection process so that you don't go essentially so that you don't go into choice paralysis.
So, I mean, using sort of McGilchrist's language, you're doing a lot of, really enhancing a dynamic shifting between left and right hemisphere.
Yes, and we know that happens with literacy anyway, right?
Yeah.
Tarot cards are words. Let's put it that way. Or at the very least, they are both under the subset of symbol that require, and you read tarot cards in a very similar way that you read words on a page, right? And you read the I Ching the same way, where you do have to kind of do this dynamical back and forth between individual symbolism at an individual level and symbolism in a contextual level.
So this reminds me of stuff from the Neoplatonic tradition, like you've read it too, Gregory Shaw's work on theurgia.
Yes.
Right, in the symptomatic practices where they would be given sets of objects and then they had to try and find the synthemata, the pattern that they all symbolically belong to. And so what you do is increase the variation, and then people and this reminds me, and you know where I'm going with it. This reminds me of sort of the deep learning strategy in neural networks, where you introduce variation and then you try and find the underlying pattern that's invariant, and then from that you introduce and this is how the brain actually learns and how artificial intelligence. So,
Yes.
so
And this is also why, if you look at medieval grimoires, right, the section of the text that is not specific spell formulae, which, by the way, I once heard spell formulae described as synesthetic equations, and that is essentially what they are.
right.
There
Yeah,
is somebody,
yeah.
there is somebody in the I Ching literature who has described the I Ching as qualitative binary notation.
I see.
Which I think is correct, right? Basically what you do is you form a synesthetic association between symbols and certain qualities. And the symbolism allows you to rearrange, especially if you have a particularly powerful imagination, allows you to rearrange, certain qualities, sensations, emotions, feeling, so that, okay, based on the grammar of the symbol, this is the state that I need to be in order to achieve this thing.
And then that
But
will dispose itself in different ways. Is that the
yes.
idea? Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, but what I was originally saying is the section of spell books that are not those formulae are giant correspondence and association tables.
Right.
Because they allow you to make more and more and more and more associations based on increasingly subtle or occulted symbolism. By the way, if this sounds like a children's game, we've had this discussion before. There is a reason so many tests of cognitive flexibility look like children's games.
Yeah.
Because children are way more flexible than an adult is ever going to be, and you need constant practice in order to maintain that flexibility.
So the I Ching, then, using this language, uses sort of multiple intervention psychotech to massively increase cognitive flexibility, right? But in this, like you say, in this systematic fashion, and this allows people to better tap into their capacity, to tap in, exact, and improve their capacity for picking up on implicit patterns. And that's how they sort of divine the course of events, or something like that. Am I understanding?
Yes. Now, of course, it is kind of one of those things where, you talk about an ecology of practice a lot.
Yeah.
The reason why, even within a divination practice, there's a bunch of things going on, right? There is, you're usually supposed to meditate a little bit before you engage in divination. The Wiccans especially have a code of ethics where there is no divination without contemplation.
Right.
You do not employ magic until you're at the end of your cognitive rope.
Right.
Because, if this sounds like a recipe for potentially going insane, that's because it is.
Right.
We've talked about...
I just want to do your slogan because I think it's a really good one. You talk about how magic is a tool, it's not a toy.
Yeah, I'll say a lot. Rule number 1, magic is not a toy. Rule number 2 is magic and money don't mix.
Yeah.
But, rule number 1 is magic is not a toy because you are playing with very, very old, very, very fundamental psychotechnologies for manipulating your ability to perceive and predict patterns in the world.
Yes.
This can very readily either essentially paralyze you for life with choice paralysis as you see everything, or you just start seeing things that aren't there.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the, and I mentioned theurgy from the Neoplatonic traditions, is you see this, I mean, so the pairing between theurgy and philosophia, you see this, that you have both these ritual practices, and then you have these practices that are designed to train rationality in more comprehensive sense, I argue for, of systematic ways of overcoming self-deception, enhancing, the religio, coupledness to the world. But you see the theurgia, especially after Iamblichus, in Proclus and Damascius, right? You see the theurgia and the philosophia always deeply interdefined, interdependent.
Yes.
And you never practice them.
Have to be.
Right.
They have to be. This is one of the reasons why I get angry at people in the science versus spirituality debate. You can't have one without the other, right? Something that I desperately want to write a book on at some point is almost the spiritual ethics of curiosity.
Right.
Because, I'm sorry, you can't be an uncurious scientist.
Yeah.
There is deep moral and existential import to being able to look at the world with awe and
Yeah.
reverence in the Woodruff line of things and just say, this is so much bigger than me. But the spiritual practices are what allow you to relate to that in an important way.
Yeah.
Right.
And experience it rather than just referring to it as well.
Exactly. Like, they're what let you tie yourself into the world. You know, it's Michelle and I have another paper on the way with Monica Ardell, which looks at the kind of relationship between wisdom and well-being as mediated through spirituality.
Yeah.
And increasingly what's becoming clear is what the sense of spirituality tracks is your sense of connectedness to something bigger.
Yeah, which is something I've been arguing for quite a while, as you know.
Oh, yeah. And actually, funnily enough, I was at I participated in a round table through the Wiccan Church of Canada a couple of weeks ago, kind of on the topic of what is magic. And something that came up is magic is both craft and feeling. It is the feeling of connectedness, of pattern, of things clicking together and something happening, as well as the craft of being able to bring about that feeling.
Right. That's very interesting. I was just going to point people to, and I'm going to have Brian on at some time, but we've been doing work with, discussion with Brian Ostafan, and he's been doing some experiments about how awe really improves sort of your cognitive flexibility, your ability to pick up on patterns.
Yes.
And then you and I, with Jennifer Steller and with Michelle, we're crafting an experiment to see where we're predicting that we're going to see that awe has important beneficial effects, which makes sense because we experience awe as a tremendously rewarding experience. People will often designate it as one of the most significant experiences in their life.
Yes. And, this is, if you'll forgive me for interrupting, one of the things that so frustrates me about scientists in general is if you look at the original intention behind the study of physics in the Hellenistic world, and, let's do my favorite thing and hop continents because this is how you see that something is real. Neo-Confucians had the very similar practice. The entire point of what the Neo-Confucians called the investigation of things, or, physics in the West, the thing that eventually turned into science and natural observation. The point is awe.
Right. Yes.
The point is not to do in the wizard and, not, measure the marigolds and things like that. The point is to encounter the sheer size and scope of everything and just let it open you.
Yeah.
And this is why I would say there can't, there can't be science without spirituality. I think this gets me in trouble with colleagues sometimes because I do treat science as sacred in a very old sense of the word.
Yes.
Yes, I wonder where I got that one from.
So this is really interesting, and I mean, I could, there's connections here to the work that Daniel's doing and the work that Anderson Todd's doing. A bunch of
we talk about this regularly.
Yeah, and so I mean, we're just sort of, just the tip of the iceberg kind of thing going on here. So what's next for you?
I mean, what's supposed to be next for me is finishing my thesis.
The Ph.D. thesis.
Yes, yeah. This kind of ties in here because, Michelle called me on this because one of the things that I want to do, so the core of my PhD thesis is on, Callard's notion of aspirations.
Right, yeah.
And the development of wisdom. And essentially, are things like wisdom and self-transcendence things that you pursue on purpose? Right. Or does, having a more coherent, purposeful approach to living life predict the development of these things?
Right.
And of course, can we affect that in the classroom? Can we affect that in workshops? Things like that.
Right.
But, the goal kind of going forward is, okay, but, how does the sense of realness fit into this, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Because what we're finding is, the first wave of my thesis research kind of found actually that the 3DWS, Monica's version of personal wisdom, and the SWIS, Igor's version of wise reasoning, seem to be tracking two different narratives regarding wisdom.
Right.
If you consider wisdom as, freedom from pain, freedom from anxiety, and a very Buddhist kind of notion of, I wouldn't even say Buddhist notion, because the actual Buddhist notion of prajna has very little to do with this.
Yeah.
But if you do kind of view it as a very, the cessation of worldly suffering, to be wise is to not suffer worldly pain. That's one narrative of wisdom, and Monica's measure seems to be tracking pretty much that.
Right.
What Igor's measure seems to be tracking is wisdom in terms of the pursuit of active growth.
Right.
So we've kind of described it as the negative narrative and the positive narrative. There's the I don't want to be this way narrative, which is tracked by the 3DWS. And there's the I do want to be this way narrative, which is tracked by the SWIS.
Oh, that's interesting.
They track different things. For example, the 3DWS, the negative wisdom tracks, freedom from stress, think a little bit more sense of control, things like that. Whereas Igor's measure tracks more things like meaning, like what you get out of this kind of thing.
It's kind of like the Epicureans and the Stoics.
Yes. I would say that, Monica's view, the negative view of wisdom, is very much tracking the Epicurean form of enlightenment, whereas the positive form of wisdom is very much tracking the Stoic form of enlightenment. Now, of course, I'm going to argue, as always, you need both.
So would I.
Yeah. You need, and, we've had this conversation elsewhere, you need to both be able to dial back your own cognitive biases and reasoning and things like that, and, basically hold yourself at bay, which is more the negative view of wisdom. But you also need to have the, shall we say, intellectual and existential courage to reach out into the world to try and change.
Yeah. So sort of meta assimilation and meta accommodation strategies, in a sense.
Yes, pretty much. So then, my interest is, okay, well, how does the sense of realness play into this? Like, especially realness of the attainability of future states of view, realness of certain practices and things like that. And then the hope is to essentially take the branch of my research that looks at aspiration and wisdom and future states of you, as well as your motivations behind why you're doing this, and stick it together with my research on wisdom and spirituality and magic to essentially say, if we give you a coherent system for growth, for self-transcendence, and, despite my, I think, infamous among our colleagues dislike of Jung, I think this is why people grab onto him so tightly, is he gives you that. He gives you that in a slightly irresponsible, scattered, and occluded kind of way, which is why I don't like him. But he gives you a narrative for growth and development. And unfortunately, as we've discussed elsewhere, so do conspiracy theories. Yeah. So
you need both. And so I was going to ask you, maybe that'll be my final question to you, and then we can wrap it up. Because just playing a little bit with the etymology, the word wizard, which is supposed to be, is an archetypal name for some sort of magic user, also means wise person. And I believe there's also connections between the word Wiccan and wisdom in some fashion, etymological fashion too.
They all go back to the Indo-European word for sight.
Right. Yeah.
This is why. This is why I don't think wisdom is an effective quality. Wisdom is ultimately a capacity to see possibilities.
Yeah.
And see the optimal route.
So sight in the sense of insight, rather than just visual perception.
I think we've had this conversation before, where you can, wisdom seems to kind of be an emergent function of insight, hindsight, and foresight.
Yes, I agree.
Where there's your ability to look deeply into a situation to see how it came about, and then to predict the multiple ways in which it can unfold. So I'm a little bit more I think, Nick Weststraight and Judith Gluck and, Michelle to an extent have the hindsight aspect of wisdom on walk.
Right.
And I think you and Igor are steadily getting into, and the lab in general, steadily getting into the insight portion of wisdom.
Right.
I'm kind of more interested in the foresight version.
Oh, this is brilliant. I hadn't seen it that way before. Oh, that's very good, Juensung. That's really beautiful. That's elegant. Oh, I like that. That's very, very, oh, wow, that's very helpful. Thank you. Oh, what a gem to end on. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, so, this is where my interest in like human ability to predict the future, sense of realness, the imagination and things like that go, because I'm more interested in the aspects of wisdom that have to do with the actualization of possibility, shall we say.
Yeah, yeah. That's very good. Oh, I like that. That's really wonderful. Well, this has been fantastic, and I wanted to thank you for this.
Thank you for having me on.
No, I mean, you and I, it's hard to pull apart our work because they're so interwoven, and people have heard your name in so many videos and episodes of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Yeah, it's made conferences interesting sometimes.
I can imagine.
I think I've made this joke with you before, but people come up to me at conferences and say, "Oh, you have John Vervaeke's name on your poster. What's he like?" And he says, "You realize that this is the guy who throws boxes of chocolate at me to get it out of his apartment, right? Like, we have a very different working relationship than you seem to imagine."
One I deeply value. So thank you very much again. I probably would like to have you on again.
Oh, absolutely.
And maybe even a three-way dialogue with you and Dan and I, or you and Anderson and I. I think that would be wonderful. And so,
oh, absolutely. I think that'd be a hoot.
I welcome you back. But thank you very much for today. It was most excellent.
Oh yeah, no, this was fun. This was fun, and it's good talking to you as always.
Thank you.